Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we're going to have a schmooze day. You know, a schmooze day on this program is one where I don't have an agenda, but I invite some friends of mine who are good talkers and quick on their feet or at the webcam, and I see what happens. I shake well and watch the explosion, only it's more like fizz as a rule. We don't know what we're going to talk about. And these people, two of them know each other, but the third one doesn't. Okay, and so what I'm going to do this time is, instead of introducing each of you and asking you to, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves, because that will give us some idea of what you might be interested in talking about today. Here is Karen Hamilton, Reverend Doctor or Dr. General Secretary Karen Hamilton. What do you want to say about yourself? Who are you, lady?
General Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches. And the Canadian Council of Churches includes pretty much all of the Christians in Canada. I've also done a lot of interfaith work. So I work with the Jewish community, Muslim community, Buddhist, Baha'i, Hindu communities, and was the co-chair of the 2018 Parliament of the World Religions, which brought 8,500 people to Canada. I do a lot of interfaith work. I teach a course in Jerusalem every year, a troubled place these days, as everybody knows. I've sponsored 2 Syrian refugee families, and, you know, that's enough for now. Though, most important, I have the tremendous privilege of being an advisor to a project which has just launched called Love My Neighbor, and it is encouraging people to give $25 in Thanksgiving for their own vaccinations, so that the 1/3 of the countries of the world that do not have vaccines right now and whose people are suffering and who have a terrible time with COVID-19 can, through UNICEF, get vaccinated. So that's
Oh, that's a glorious suggestion. All right, I'll whip out my checkbook right away. I just had my vaccination 40 minutes ago. Perfect. So I'm ready with my checkbook. Thank you for doing that.
And you can go to the UNICEF website or just Google Love My Neighbor.
All right, good idea. Okay, here's Nadine Block. Who are you, lady?
I'm glad to be here, Meta. My name's Nadine. As you said, I live outside of the District of Columbia, the colony in the United States. Although I live in Maryland, I have full voting rights. And just want your listeners to know that the District of Columbia still does not have full voting rights or citizenship as a member of the state in the United States. So we are in favor of DC statehood and work on that, connected to all kinds of other issues. So one of the things that I do is I work locally, nationally, globally with a crew called Beautiful Trouble. We are organizers, activists, artists, all united to support people-powered movements and make them more effective and irresistible. As Tony Cade Bambara says, we're in the business of making revolution irresistible. Nice. And I myself am an artist as well, and I contributed to Beautiful Trouble and work a lot in the DMV, the Washington area, the District, Maryland, and Virginia area, on all kinds of issues from economic justice to locally to global issues, like Karen mentioned on the vaccine, where we've been very involved in lobbying for the US to share the patents and to share our resources, and just had perhaps a significant, but at least a minor win with the Biden administration agreeing to meet about this. A World Trade Organization that is implicated in holding these vaccine patents too tightly and too limited to the richest nations. And so we're actively putting pressure on, and there are plenty of folks also actively meeting with the administration and pressuring them to do the right thing as far as negotiating what we call the TRIPS waivers and other more in-depth things. But what people should know is that there are things to do, whether it's donate money or advocate to your electeds. If you're part of, quote unquote, the developed world that has too much vaccine or clear access above and beyond what other people have, don't sit idly by, definitely get involved. And I think that's perhaps where my most important involvement is I'm a trainer and a facilitator for people-powered movements and support them worldwide.
when I advertised who was coming to each other, I had, like 5 words that I described each of you. And I described you as a puppeteer because I thought that would surprise some people. How am I going to talk to a puppeteer? Let me think. So what are these puppets that you make?
I will say I think of myself not even so much as just a puppeteer or an artist, but more of a cultural worker. And I'm really dedicated to both the process and the strategy of using arts and culture in the work that we do. So yeah, I do make giant puppets, whether they're giant dogs or most recently, what have we done? Giant workers talking about the Fight for 15 campaign here in the United States, or a human-sized Candyland game, which people might remember from childhood, where you move things around a board, but we called it Caring Land to focus on what the administration needed to do to help people survive COVID and particularly support families here in the United States, and life-size figures human-sized figures that people could move around 20 by 20 or 7 meter by 7 meter board made out of canvas that we could stake out in a yard. So there's all kinds of ways of thinking about what the props are or puppets are that we can make to visualize and help people understand these complicated issues. And sometimes we use them to blockade streets or to disrupt business as usual, which we have to do sometimes to make change happen.
Thank you. Okay. And now I get to introduce an old friend of yours, Phil Bogdanov. Phil, what do you have to say for yourself?
I like Nadine, live just outside of the district. I'm very sympathetic. I did live in the district for a while and definitely noticed the lack of votes. So I'm very sympathetic to that campaign, and it looks like things may be shifting in a direction where we might actually have something happen soon. So I met Nadine at Cornell. We had breakfast together every Thursday morning for a number of years, along with, at one point it was 60 other people focused on disarmament issues. I got to work with a guy named Charlie Hall, professor in ecology and systematics. He had 2 main interests at the time. One project was looking at the global carbon cycle as it related to climate change. We knew how much CO2 was being added to the atmosphere by the accounting of burning of fossil fuels and the production of cement, and we knew only about half of it was staying up there. The puzzle at the time was, where did the other half go? And we were part of a number of teams around the world of scientists that were attempting to kind of nail down more precisely what was happening in each sector. The result, after maybe a decade of work, is kind of a consensus that about 90% of that excess CO2 gets absorbed by the oceans, and the other 10% gets absorbed by the terrestrial plants. Charlie Hall's other interest was energy. Harder the industry was drilling, the less oil per effort it was finding. So the question was, why is that happening? Because every year they produce a list of the top 10 ranked best sites for drilling oil. So if you're not drilling a lot, you pick the top 1 or 2, and your probability of finding oil is very high. But if you're drilling hard because you're trying to find more oil, you get farther down that list, and you have a greater chance of hitting a dry hole and not getting a return. So that's why there was this sort of inverse relationship of finding less oil per effort, not less oil total, but less oil per effort. Anyway, he's been very instrumental in sort of applying this concept of energy return on investment or net energy analysis to everything from solar panels to wind to, sort of full life cycle accounting for a nuclear power plant, what goes into producing it, the land destruction, the energy generated, refining, and decommissioning and storage and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of the studies that have come out are basically showing that some of these resources aren't as beneficial to society as initially people thought when you do the full cost accounting. Recently, I've actually started speaking about this. I gave a talk last night that was, the broad title was Our Energy Predicament, and it's looking at the fact that we are currently placing a lot of hope into solar and wind, and the reality is that they're actually very tiny percentage, no more than 3% worldwide of our energy sources, we're still highly, highly dependent on fossil fuels, and we will be for decades to come. And as everybody's trying to kind of generate these net zero or zero emissions targets, I think they're setting goals that are going to be very, very difficult to achieve without looking at our overall consumption patterns, and there's like a 96% correlation between the consumption of fossil fuels and GDP. So if you want to shrink the fossil fuels, you're probably going to have an impact on GDP or standard of living. So you're going to be asking people to be poorer next year unless we develop some very creative ways of living together. And I just recommend, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Derek Jensen, Lierre Keith, and Max Wobert. This came out in mid-March, called Bright Green Lies. They do a lot of the number crunching on these renewables and our dreams.
Phil, it sounds like your conclusion is very pessimistic. Is that the final conclusion, or are you on the way to telling me, but there's a silver lining someplace?
Well, realistically, the answer is very pessimistic. We probably should have started 20 years ago to address this issue, like some people called for. I think we're headed as human civilization towards a very severe bottleneck. The question is, what we do now. I think some sir in England said the next 5 years is going to determine what the next 10,000 years of life looks like on this planet. So it's increasingly important for us to make choices to help, expand that bottleneck so fewer species go extinct. So if, humans on the other side of it have a better chance of having a more biodiverse, robust kind of ecosystem to live inside of. But I'm afraid we're headed for some hard times, and I think they're going to hit us much sooner than most people realize, because this energy return on investment, when we first started pumping oil out of the ground in the 1930s, we could get 100 barrels of oil for the equivalent about 1 barrel of effort, whether that's the capital expenditure or the actual, energy to run the drills, to manufacture the pipes, et cetera, et cetera. So when all that infrastructure is converted into an energy, barrel per oil equivalent, we were getting 100 back for every one we invested. Now we have slid over the years. We're now down to probably 18 to 1. So if you average everything that we're doing in terms of fossil fuels, that ratio has declined, and it's going to decline further. And as it does, a growing portion of our civilization is going to be scrambling and investing in trying to harvest more energy. So you can think of it, when you have 100 to 1 return on investment, that means one person out of 100 is involved in the energy industry, and the other 99 can do whatever they want, more or less. They can teach at a university, they can play in a symphony, they can be a policeman, et cetera, because they're not being farmers. 200 years ago, we 85% of our population was involved in agriculture, more. And we've had the benefit now for 100, 150 years of this tremendous energy resource. And so we have changed the way our society functions so that very few people now farm, are directly involved in farming, and very few were involved in harvesting energy in other forms. But that's going to change. In February, we saw headlines from Shell and BP saying they're now anticipating that we're past peak oil, and the ability to sort of pump oil out of the ground is going to start to decline. Shell even put a 1 to 2% number on it. The people have looked at this over the long decades and looked at the various oil fields, thinks that when things get rolling, we're going to be looking at a 6 to 8% decline per year. So if you know your rule of 72, a 6% decline, that's 12 years. In 12 years, the amount of energy available from fossil fuels will decline by half. So to take your personal household.
I haven't heard anybody talking about peak oil in 5 years.
Well,
I'm sorry. I I really wrote that off as a misleading issue a long time ago.
Well, we in the U.S. we were rescued by fracking, by shale oil, and we bumped up our domestic production by almost 50% above where it was. Otherwise, we would have been on the downside of peak oil. If you look at the fundamentals, and I can show a chart if you like, but even the fracking source is now in steep decline. So the people that are looking at this expect that this year we're going to start to feel the bite from that decline.
That is not a worry of mine. I'm sorry. I've got a lot of other worries that I'm going to put ahead, like emitting methane from the East Siberian Sea. That's going to get us before we run out of. I mean, all we have to do is go up there and capture some of that stuff, and we're in business. Okay, look, I think what we need to look at is the connection between the issues that you have alluded to, which are too numerous to count even, but and the fact that the thing that needs to be done is a whole lot more public awareness, and that's where Karen and Nadine and even I, have some level of engagement. I don't crunch any numbers, but I spend a hell of a lot of time trying to get people to listen to me and listen to you. So Karen and Nadine, tell me.
Well, what I was going to say is, and there's a way to sort of spin off of what Philip was saying, which takes us back to where we began about the vaccinations and the COVID-19. And I don't know all of the conversation, although I'm very familiar, Philip, with all that is going on there and the difference that fracking has made for worse, probably in the United States. But one of the conversations that's happening a lot in Canada, and the question is, can we sustain it, is what have we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic? And the environmental issues are a big part of that. All of a sudden, the skies are clearer, the water is clearer. We're all seeing pictures of the Venice canals that are now, you can see the bottom, which you never could before because of the downturn in tourism. Also, big conversation. Yeah, it's quite a dramatic picture. Look, Google it. So climate issues have risen to the fore in the COVID conversations. What have we learned? What can we do without, for instance, this Zoom presentation? How many in-person meetings are really going to go back to being in person and requiring people to fly using fossil fuels when we can do things by Zoom? People are asking those kind of questions in a very intentional way. Can we sustain those conversations? That's my question, and a question the faith communities are very engaged in. So climate is one issue that has risen to the fore, and the changes COVID-19 has brought, and how can we move forward in those changes? The other one has to do, of course, with race, which is also huge in the United States, but also present here, and the realization that we're much more locked down here in Canada than you have been in the United States. And one of the realities is that the essential workers, this has been brought very much to people's attention, and again, particularly in faith communities, essential workers are often people of color. So they have not been able to lock down and be safe in their homes on their nice, tidy Zoom screens. They've been out being vulnerable, being exposed. The hotspot areas, Meta, you'll know in Toronto, are areas where there is a high refugee population, a high immigrant population, and almost entirely people of color. And they have been, so right now, just for those of you in the States, one of the big pushes in Toronto right now, where Meta, I'm not actually in Toronto right now, but where Meta and I live a lot of the time, is we're doing specific hotspot vaccinations for the populations who are essential workers, but are also living in more close proximity than some of the rest of us. And so it's really become a justice issue, a huge justice issue. How can there be equity? The hotspots in Toronto are the places where people with lower incomes live. So how do we sustain the actions, to go to Nadine, how do we sustain the actions and the protests and the advocacy that needs to happen to keep that awareness of the real life situations of vulnerable folk and how they're impacted when something like COVID happens? And so climate is one conversation we've got to keep happening that has been heightened by COVID. racism and the vulnerable populations, and their less access to healthcare, and financial instability, housing instability. All of those conversations were happening, but they've been much heightened. So, and then we talked about the global and the vaccine access. Well, it's a problem, local vaccine access. We seem to have changed it now. I see Nadine nodding. We seem to have changed it now in Toronto. And here's one clever example. Many of the Syrian refugee families I've helped sponsor have moved into an area in Toronto called Thorncliffe Park. Well, it's Ramadan, as you will all well be aware, and that changes people's schedules a huge amount. So the vaccination
Thorncliffe Park is what's going on there?
Many immigrant and refugee families live in there. Yeah. It's almost entirely immigrant and refugee families who are essential workers, who are on the front lines, who don't get to stay in their cozy Zoom houses. And it's Ramadan. Many of them are Muslim. It's Ramadan. So this incredibly clever, creative, Nadine, here's one, if you haven't heard of it, advocate for this. Ramadan changes people's schedules. They live very differently because of the prayer cycle and the fasting. They fast from dawn until sunset, and not sunrise, dawn, which makes it longer, until sunset. People are tired, and they are fasting to be in solidarity with the poor, and there's an expectation that much will be given. So the Muslim community has risen to this challenge to raise money and advocate for vaccines for developing countries. Muslim community has risen to the challenge in a huge way. So here's a clever creativity that Nadine's engaged in. So when it's Ramadan and all those factors are at play and people are tired and schedules are different and meal times are different, how do you do vaccinations in a way that works? So what they're doing is pop-up clinics, Meta, in Thorncliffe Park right now, today. The families I know are getting vaccinated today, and they're running them until the wee hours of the morning. They're running them because the fast is broken at about 8 o'clock at night. So they're ramping up. And so the vaccines are being given from 9 o'clock at night, like earlier, but mostly from 9 o'clock at night till 1 or 2 in the morning. And in one day, 4,000 people were vaccinated. It's so clever. And it's working with people's culture. You use that word too, Nadine. It's working with people's culture. It's working with people's reality. It's acknowledging the vulnerabilities and saying, we're not going to do this the way that we, white middle-class Protestants would normally do things, 9 to 5, make your appointments, show up. All of which assumes also internet access, which not everybody has. So the creativity is also something that we've learned a bit better in COVID. Can we hang on to that too? Can we do climate issues differently? Can we not have, global meetings anymore? I mean, the churches and the faith communities are one of the, after businesses, they do a lot of global meetings. How do you communicate with but it's a challenge. Nadine's nodding, but how do you really get to know your sisters and brothers in Africa and what their real issues are if you can never meet them face to face, if you only meet by Zoom? It's complicated, it's challenging, but the questions are being asked. And the questions around vulnerability are being asked. Canada, for instance, slowed down its refugee intake dramatically during COVID-19 because it was, we were afraid. But it meant that people are languishing in refugee camps in Jordan who have been promised that they will be brought to Canada, and eventually they will. But it's meant several years more in horrible conditions in Jordan. So vulnerability and then creativity. So those would be the three lessons that I'm struggling with, that I think our society needs to struggle with, Canadians need to struggle with, the faith communities are very aware of and are engaging in. And, I'm in sort of, because I'm drawing in Nadine in this, but your response to Philip is, I do believe that's where the hope lies. I do believe there is hope, but complacency has got to go completely out the window. And it's got to be sustained, and it's got to be tenacious, and it's got to be creative, and it's got to be visible, and it's got to be all of those things. So,
So I'll jump in there on that, Karen and Phil. I love actually I love hearing these stories about Cornell because I can't hardly remember them. And you did remind me that I believe the reason why I was involved was because I started my activist work worrying about nuclear weapons, right? Like we were in the time period in the US where we had a policy called MAD, mutually assured destruction. That was a real thing. Like, how do we blow each other up? And not just once, not just twice, but how many times can we blow each other up, this former Soviet Union and the United States? And so from that, the questioning begins about why are we spending so much of our time and energy on death and destruction when people here on this planet right now need some basic things like food and clean water and healthcare and education. So very quickly for me, that fear, that, not irrational, that totally rational fear about nuclear weapons. And I also was in the sciences there, and I contributed to research on the nuclear winter theory. Remember that? We haven't heard about that for a long time.
Oh, yes, you have. It's back again. It never went away. It was real the whole time. Even when we thought about it, that it wasn't true. It was true.
It was true. And a professor there, I did research for a professor there called Mark Harwell, who was working on this study, made famous probably by Carl Sagan, right? Anyway, so there was all those connections. So thank you for reminding me of that. And the essential element of engagement, Karen, and like my big thing over this whole year, being in Washington, D.C., which I've always felt as it's both a blessing and a curse, a responsibility and a promise. We are here at what I call the center of all evil. Like, we're all people who are making decisions that are going to affect massive amounts of other people on the world are here. The lobbying arm of every major oil company, for example, is here if they don't have a regular office. Pharma has an office here. You just can go on and on and on. As an activist, you want to speak to someone in power, they are here, or they're coming here, or they do something here at some point. So it's much different than in a lot of the other places I've lived in my life, where it's a rural community and the only access to the federal government that you have is the post office, and you like the post office, right? You're not gonna go. But anyways, so it's a very interesting position here, and we've been protesting consistently. And as to quote Arundhati Roy, like, seeing the pandemic as a portal. Are we going to understand that together we walk through to a better future? Yep. Or are we going to drag all this outdated baggage of fossil fuel infrastructure, poisoning our ecosystem, racism, sexism, homophobia, you name it, with us? Or shall we just put that down before we walk through this door to the future? And this potentially gives us an opportunity to do that. Although we know around the world, and including India right now, there's incredible hardship and struggle around these things. So in Washington, I would say, just to talk about engagement, COVID not only gave people a moment to reflect, it gave other people, particularly white middle class people, another excuse not to go and be active. Oh, I need to be careful. And that is honestly true. Like, we did need to be careful, and we needed to figure it out. But one of the things in Washington, D.C. that we recognize because of our position here is that we needed to get back out in the public sphere, back in the streets almost immediately. I think we took off a week or two in March where we were truly panicked about how to do this safely. And I remember the first action we did, holding a small banner on, I think it was the end of March, early April last year, holding a banner that called for one of the relief acts for COVID. And we were really frightened, like really frightened. Were the cops going to arrest us? Were we going to be thrown into jail, where there is, of course, no social distancing and no masks, and another really vulnerable population around the world? What was going to happen? And I will tell you, we were ignored. And we were relieved about that. We held our banner, we got our pictures, it went out widely, and then we consistently have been in the streets. And of course, you know that Black Lives Matter and the justice for killing of Black men and women here in the United States has gone global. There were thousands and thousands, perhaps accumulatively the largest protest that ever happened.
But Nadine, I've been wondering all this time, how much evidence is there about what happens to people who go out there and do what you're doing? I didn't know you were still doing it, but all those people in the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and God knows the thing where they were storming the Congress, those people have to be exposing themselves. Has there been work on trying to find out how many people got sick as an explicit result of being
We have a lot of documentation, and this is where sometimes being scientifically trained is useful for me. I know Philip is much more the scientist. Like, I can't even speak like a scientist anymore, which is too bad. But in some cases, and helpful in others. So we, even just today, I read a story about the CDC, right? The Center for Disease Control in the United States released just recently a thing where I think the figure was 10. There's only up to 10%, less than 10% of people who go out of transmissions happen outside. And that was a false number. It's 0.1% of cases have been documented to happen outside between people, because this is now very well known, a disease that's passed by aerosols. And if you go inside and you act like a ridiculous anti-democratic insurrectionist in the Capitol in the United States on January 6th, you are exposing yourself and many other people to severe risk. But if you are outside, as it turns out, we have very low indication that there's any transmission. And in fact, people looked at the numbers. You can track this. There's lots of ways scientists do this, about how many people are going out. These days, we also have cell phone data to track who's going where. We've tracked how cell phone data can show us that, for example, for spring break, the diseases traveled from the north to the south and vice versa when people went from the northeast of the US down to Florida. So we have very good information that if you're masked and you're outside, transmission levels are very low. And we did not see any spikes associated with any of the giant demonstrations that happened over the past year. So just offering that, this doesn't mean that everyone should go outside and protest. If you're an autoimmune compromised person, if you're taking care of an elderly person or someone who's autoimmune, you don't need to make those decisions, because there are plenty of jobs to do in the movement and supporting this work that don't have to be done outside on the so-called front lines of activism.
What about stadiums? Because there were a lot of demonstrations and stuff that took place in a stadium. It's outdoors. Is that good enough?
Seems to be.
Apparently.
The issue here is engagement, right? And I really do want to encourage people to plug in wherever. I'm so heartened to hear Karen had to go, but I'm heartened to hear about Karen's work and mobilizing the religious communities. I mean, if you want to be an effective organizer and you need to mobilize people quickly, you have to go where they are already organized. And the churches and the mosques and the synagogues, all of the temples, these are places that are already well organized. And it's helpful to give them the scientific background and the information that they need, as well as the organizing places to plug in that they need, so they can be active and engaged members of the community on all kinds of issues, not just in spiritual, work. So I think
I'm inferring from that what we should do is, it's going to be summer, so we have a number of months in which people could organize events out of doors. I think, if you're going to have a church service, don't do it indoors, do it outside, I suppose.
I still think that that's smart. Although, we're seeing, because of the numbers of people who are vaccinated, perhaps some indoor stuff can happen, but I don't see any justification actually for doing that when we have potential access for holding all these events outside. And we've been holding nonviolent action trainings, nonviolent action protests, all kinds of creative things outside. And like Phil said about one of the big issues in the United States right now about fossil fuels and stopping our ridiculous infrastructure investment is to stop the pipelines from going in. This affects both Canada and the US, whether it's the KXL pipeline or what we're now fighting is called Line 3 and the Dakota Access Pipeline, which has been stopped but not completely shut down, the whole project. So that's what we're talking about, holding the Biden administration, and of course the administration in Canada and other places, to stop these new infrastructure investments in this completely outdated, fossilized, harmful infrastructure. Because Phil, there's no jobs on a dead planet. There's no racism on a dead planet. There's no nothing.
Not only that, but it looks like what you guys are advocating should fit together beautifully. You say no pipelines. I totally agree. But why would you want pipelines if there's no fuel to put through them? And Phil is projecting the shortage of fuel. I don't believe him, but I think there's going to be an enormous amount of fuel in the form of, if nothing else, methane. But at any rate, whatever it is, the sooner we get rid of it, the fossil fuels, the better. So the focus, I think it should be simply forget about, trying to save fossil fuels, just make every effort to switch over to other types of sustainable energy. By the way, I'm going to do a talk show with a guy. I don't know whether it's somebody you knew at Cornell. I can't even remember his name, but we're going to do a talk show on geothermal, because he is a professor there, and you may know him, Phil, they have a place on campus at Cornell where they're digging a hole or something. And he said, well, wait until we have our thing operating, and then I'll tell you how it's going. So in another month or two, he and I are going to have a conversation about geothermal. Now, what I think is there's no shortage of geothermal energy. It's all down there. The question is, how hard is it to reach? How economically feasible is it to dig the hole to get at it? Why do we have to worry about it? The center of the earth is hot. and so why not switch to, if we can't do it all with solar and wind, let's get busy and dig some more holes, right?
Well, I mean, our neighbors just put in a geothermal system, and I think it costs them between $7,000 and $10,000 to do so. So that's not something that's easily accessible for most people. And the payback period, the lifespan of that system before major repairs is about 30 years. So it's not a, say it and do it and it's done kind of thing. It requires significant investment. One of the things that the county in its climate action plan is looking at is reducing emissions from the residential sector, which come from heating and air conditioning. So what does that mean? 450,000 houses in Montgomery County, who's going to make the investment to tighten up the weatherization, to do the super insulation, to get everybody to convert their appliances from gas to, induction stoves, et cetera, et cetera. All that is a lot of infrastructure investment that has, what's there now has been built up over 100, 200 years, right? It's been amortized and people are paying a very low overhead for it. But to make a major shift is going to require a lot of investment or a drastic reduction in consumption patterns. So while I'm sympathetic to stopping these pipelines, look at this Colonial one that's been hacked now and is shut down. Mm-hmm. They're anticipating getting it back online, but you read between the lines and you see what kind of forecasting they're doing. If it does stay shut down for extended periods, it's going to affect, gasoline prices, heating oil, jet fuel. It's going to have a ripple effect that's going to really magnify. So when you're talking about, can I share my screen?
Yeah.
While he's booting up, it's the green button on the bottom, Phil. One of the key things is talking about lowering people's energy needs, right? Really, we're talking about conservation has to be the first thing, because mm-hmm. that's the least amount of investment mm-hmm. of anything, and it's accessible to everyone. And then go ahead, Phil. Oh, look at this. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is, yeah. So that, you know what a pie chart is. It's a circle that's divided up into slices. This is called a Sankey chart. That's the form of the chart. And it has energy sources on the left and ultimate use on the right. And then in between, some of the purposes to which it's put. So you'll notice the size of the pipes is how much energy flows through them. So petroleum at the bottom in the green, biomass, coal, natural gas. You can see just the petroleum, the fossil fuel based ones, petroleum, coal, and natural gas, is considerable amount of our energy. It turns out for the US, it's about 83% of our current energy consumption. Solar up at the top and wind, a few down in purple, are still tiny. And I did at the lower right here a calculation solar and wind adding up, 1.25 and 3.01, and dividing by the number at the very top, the 92, 93 quads. So for the US, solar and wind account for 3.5% of our energy input. This is Maryland a few years earlier, less than 1.4%. This is a projection I found from 2018 to 2050, the best modeling and analysis to think, how can we change this? So this is more than 30 years. And you'll notice on the right side, the yellow solar has grown, the wind has grown, and the biggest shrinkage has occurred in coal. So we basically replaced electricity generation from coal with solar and wind. We've had to expand the natural gas because that's the load shifting, when it's dark outside and there's not enough to meet peak demand. We rely on spinning up natural gas turbines. We've reduced oil a little bit, but we're still, even 30 years from now, almost half of our energy is still coming from fossil fuels. So the reality is, Nadine, and let me see if I find one more here. This is Charlie Hall's famous balloon graph. The blue or purple are historic data. So at the very top left, domestic oil production in 1930, that's the 100-to-1 return on investment. The size of the bubble is how much energy is in that resource. Whether how far to the left or right it is how much it's contributing currently to production. So domestic oil in 1970, when it dropped down to less than 40-to-1 to about 30-to-1, on the left scale there, you'll see it's generating between 20 and 25 quads of our, now close to 100 quad demand in the U.S.
I can't make sense of any of these graphs, frankly.
Well,
they're very pretty, but I really don't get it.
Well,
I'm not good at reading maps or anything, but
I'll just point out in the lower left, you'll see wind, photovoltaics, biodiesel, gasohol, and tar sands. They are a tiny, tiny source of energy, and we're not going to be able to run our current civilization standard of living on them in any time in the future. And so, and I'll stop sharing. So, sympathetic as I am to stopping these pipelines, you're basically cutting your own throat by saying, stop this energy flow. You're going to be creating turmoil and economic dislocation and poverty in the future if those resources aren't available. So there are going to be very, very strong forces at play across many sectors to keep that fossil energy flowing, unfortunately. So I think the fight is going to be largely symbolic. When people start to feel the pinch because of the shortage, there's going to be political backlash against environmentalists, and the leaders are going to have to sort of kowtow to the producers in order to keep our economy running. There's no getting around the sort of physical realities of how we've created this infrastructure that is dependent upon these fuels. And the effort to create the renewables is actually going to accelerate emissions because the renewables are created by the fossil fuel industry. Wind and solar are created by the current economy. So if you want to ramp up production to the scale that's needed to replace the fossil fuels, the faster you do that, the more emissions you're going to create in the short term to get there. And when you do get there, your energy return on investment numbers are going to be, at best, half of what we're currently running our society on, which means that we can only support half of what we're supporting. So half the hospitals, half the universities.
There's a lot.
I don't know, because I know people in economists and financial people who worry about the opposite. They say these oil companies keep going and looking for extra reserves of oil, when in fact they're creating what do they call it? Stranded assets. They've got so much of it already, they'll never be able to use it. And it no matter what we do, there's going to be an abundance of it left over forever, because we couldn't possibly use it all up, because we're switching so quickly to renewable energy. And therefore we do not put your money into fossil fuels, because you're going to be left with a whole bunch of it in the ground that nobody can even buy, that you can't sell it.
Well, the issue is it's going to be left in the ground because it's going to cost more energy to get it out than you get when you get it out. This is showing the peaking of global production. We are now we have been at the top since about 2008 through present day, that bumpy sort of shading just before the line. Absent, fracking, we would have already started the decline. This is looking at production for BP. You notice the downward trend to the right. This is mobile, downward trend to the right.
But I think so. But if we're talking about what the reality on the road is, the reality in people's daily lives, I think that there are real things to consider around more efficiency. And I do know that there's issues that the more efficient we get, the more people's use goes up. Sometimes, it's not necessarily a direct correlation that our use goes down. I do think one thing we haven't addressed is the immense amount of energy that is being used for things like digital currency and Zooming and storing our data online, which people are going to have to reckon with, right? Because you can't be green and do all those, be really fully green and do all those things. You have to somehow go on a digital diet in order to make our use of energy more responsible online as well. And I do think when we talk about reducing our energy consumption, I think that that's really important, reducing our stuff. And if Karen were here, she might point out, like, that is one of the lessons hopefully people will take with them from this pandemic. It's not clear to me that that will happen because we are so drugged by the consumer society. We haven't mentioned the word capitalism, but we do see that right now the way capitalism is used, it creates all these external costs. And the external costs include, obviously, the cost of destroying our climate, the cost of racism and sexism and homophobia, and all the tragedies that are acted upon us as individuals and people and communities. So if we can internalize those costs, so if, for example, the cost of building this so-called pipelines were actually reflected, the external costs, the cost to the environment were reflected, then we would actually not be building so much of this old-fashioned fossilized infrastructure, and instead would actually have a better way to judge what's happening. And particularly with energy, and I bet we would agree on this, is we have just a completely outdated way of thinking about this. Like, energy needs to be produced more in a localized fashion. One size does not fit all. In Maryland, it's clear, where we live here in the eastern side of Maryland, we don't have massive amounts of oil. What we do have potentially is maybe some hydro, maybe some geo, maybe some wind. If we think about it in a little bigger, the region, maybe in the southeast of the United States, might be using more solar than they're using anything else, or whatever it is. And to get away from this capitalist, consumerist, one size fits all thought process would then, of course, limit the amount of shipping of energy sources that happens and the associated loss of shipping energy from one place to another. And if we start producing more locally, then of course people have more of a direct relationship with the cost of what is going into local production. And then we have potentially more of an incentive to use it responsibly, and so on like that. So there's a bigger picture approach that I hate the word hopeful, but that would, I think, make a big difference in how we view production and use of energy going forward if we had realistic costs associated with fossil fuel infrastructure in particular. And the subsidies that we use there are also applied in other sources that might be more appropriate in particular locations. And not to considerably think about humongous size projects that aren't actually appropriate.
So I agree with the desire and the vision, but I think we have to do our homework and face facts. So, for example, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Government updated a report called What Our Region Grows in 2019, in January 2019. Lindsay Smith was one of the speakers at one of our Climate Action Coffee forums on the food system, everything from what the Food Council is doing to, what's projected for going forward. Mike was there from the food co-op and so on. That report shows, it's not a comprehensive, but it does have a kind of a market basket representative sample of crops that are grown in this region. Of the table crops that we eat, not the commodity crops like corn, soybean, wheat that typically get exported, this region probably grows 5% or less of what we eat in this region. And when I pushed Lindsay after her public comment, she said it's probably, for most things, less than 1%. I did a calculation based on population and some rough seat of the pants numbers of how much land you need to grow you need about 2 acres, the bare minimum, to grow enough food year round for a household of 4. The amount of land in Montgomery County that could be used to grow food, if we maxed out everything, could only support about 25% of our population. So we are well over the carrying capacity of this region. And that's just looking at agriculture. That's not any of the energy needs. We had a big fight in the Ag Reserve about whether commercial scale solar could be put there. And a lot of us rallied behind the farmers to say, not over prime farmland, because we're going to need that. Yeah. So that's an issue everywhere in the world. Our population has grown way beyond carrying capacity of most regions, partly because of subsidies of fossil fuels. So when you want to constrict those, when you want to reduce emissions to zero, you have to face what you're actually asking people to do, which is, take your current salary and divide it by 10 and live on that. Yeah. And that's getting you close to it. It's more likely divided by 100 and live on that 1%. Yeah. That's what we're facing structurally. The question is, how do we get people to the point where we can live on that amount of energy and still have a reasonable standard of living,
Well, and I still think there's lots of other perspectives on how to get there. So while I also live in Montgomery County, I think that might be an outdated way to think about the systems, although it is in place right now. And so we do have this sort of push me, pull you. And I think the biggest message, if anybody takes anything away from this hour, and I'm going to have to go soon as we close up, is that people need to be actively engaged, right? Don't just sit at home with your worry. If you're a scientist, do look at those charts and figure out what it means for you personally. If that doesn't make sense to you, if you're like Meta and you don't want to read those charts, that's also fine. Read something that somebody writes or watch something that speaks to you and get actively involved in the decision making that happens in your name and with your tax dollars, or in your name alone, because it is our responsibility to make decisions that will determine the future and how we walk through this portal, which right now is somehow shifting even as I speak, and we emerge from this pandemic into the post-pandemic world, at least for the moment, this particular pandemic of the COVID virus, because we do have pandemics of racism and pandemics of capitalism and pandemics of many other kinds that we really do need to address. And it's up to each of us to figure out how we contribute and address those things. And it may be that you're a scientist and you do research that adds to our knowledge of how the balances are being held, what happens to the carbon. It may be that you're an activist and you do go out and blockade a shipment of fossil fuel infrastructure equipment. It may be so that somebody actually knows what's happening. It may be that you're in your local community, as I am today, trying to save the last piece of public property from development by a corporation that is going to basically serve to upscale the community and probably force people out because of increased rents. So figure out how you're going to be involved and do something at the level that seems to make a sense for where you are in your community and in your life. And by gosh, actually do it in community if you can. Don't go it alone. Get support, even if it's just somebody you talk to at your kitchen table. Get support and stick with it. When you get tired, take a break, but come back. We cannot afford to be watching this destruction happen at this time. That's what.
Okay, thank you so much, Nadine. I needed your pep talk. Phil wiped me out. Okay, so we've got to come back at this another time because I like the energy that Nadine is requiring of us because she demands it, damn it. We have to do this and we're going to do this. And Phil, you've got to do it too. So shut up. No more belly aching. Get out there and do it, whatever it is.
I am. I'm very involved at local, county, state, national, international levels, trying to push.
Okay.
I think it's the farmers and ranchers that are going to save us. But
well, I absolutely tend to agree on that one. But here we go. All right, we're over time, and that's fine because it's been very interesting. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.